which is a little bit ambitious, but that's okay. And it's a story that everybody knows. So I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. What I want to do is present it from a particular perspective, which is the lesson of Emunah, which the Megillah brings to us. And when looked at in this way, there are certain themes one can pick out and certain tropes that keep returning. And when you look at it in this way, you can never look at it in a different way as you did before. It's an instructive lesson that sticks with one year on year. And I hope that what we'll learn through together tonight, you'll find will change your view of the Megillah for the rest of your life, and you'll be able to share it with other people. It may also change your life itself, which is, if that can be achieved, that's a great thing. I know it's given me a powerful lesson. So I'm going to do a screen share now. And it's a simple PowerPoint where I just display the verses that I'm talking about. So you'll not see me so much anymore. Forgive me if I look away. I've actually got two screens here, one with my notes and one with the PowerPoint. So you should be able, can somebody just give me a wave if they can see the PowerPoint on the screen? Yeah, they can. Brilliant. So I'm going to start playing it now. Here we are. There we go. Okay. So if I look away, just because I'm looking at my notes here, I'll try to keep as eye to eye as I can as we go along. And let's see how we do. So we're going to start off from the very beginning. And we've got here, like I say, it's something we all know, but I'm going to pick out particular details. Nothing that I say is original. It's all from the Mefarshim, mainly the Malbim, but some others as well, as you'll hear the names coming up as we go along. So it starts off here, Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh. It came to pass in the days of Achashverosh. At the first, he's not a king at all. He's just a man. Who Achashverosh? That is Achashverosh, Hamelech, who was reigning, Mehoduvad Kush, he was reigning from India to Ethiopia. Then in verse 2, he's called Hamelech Achashverosh, the king Achashverosh. So there's a progress here. He starts off as a person, then he becomes a person who has assumed the role of king. And only later on do we see he's achieved the title of king. And here in a nutshell, right from the start, we've seen that Ahasuerus was power hungry. He wanted to be in charge. He wanted to be king. And he maneuvered himself with adroit political machinations to the situation where he actually, unbelievably, became king. And he displaced the Babylonian empire that had come before him and got rid of that and set himself up as the new king, and also set about eradicating the remnants of Babylonian life and re-establishing himself as the man in charge. And we'll see that his political maneuvering is particularly adroit. We'll see that one of the things he did was he married Vashti. We know about that. We'll come to that in a second. And perhaps he did this initially to legitimize his reign. After all, he married the Vashti, who was a Babylonian, and he thought that this would mean that he was sort of grafting himself on to the Babylonian Empire, which had been very prestigious in its day. But no, he wanted something else. He wanted to become king in his own right. He didn't want to have borrowed legitimacy or in-law legitimacy. He wanted to be his own man, the man in charge. Therefore, we see he sat on the throne of his own kingdom, the end of verse 2 there, Asher b'Shushan Habira, which was in Shushan. He moved the center of power away from where it had been before to his own seat of power in Shushan. It's like moving the capital city of the UK from London to, I don't know, Southampton, and saying, the London stuff is done now, we're moving somewhere else. This was his initial power play. Let's now look at the guest list for his big party. We know he made a party for 180 days. And who's on the list? Well, let's have a look. He made a party for all his princes and servants. That's his entourage, his nearest and dearest. Then he had the army, Chel Parasamodai, the soldiers. Then it says, Hapartamim, the nobles, V'sarei Hamadinas, and the princes of the different provinces. These were the people, these last were the people who you would have thought had the real power. These were the dukes and the earls and the counts of each part of his kingdom. And yet they were last on the list. First of all, he has his entourage, the people who naturally were associated with him. Then he puts the army next up. because he knows the army is where it's at. If you've got the army on your side, as anybody who wants to lead a coup will know, it's always about getting the army on your side. It's happening in Myanmar right now, where in staging a coup against the government, it basically army-led. Colonel Gaddafi did the same thing, but many others have done this. You need to get the army. And that's what he did. He put them before the dukes and the nobles. They were also runs, and he wanted them to feel that he wasn't afraid of their fame and their status because he had military muscle on his side. He puts them last. In verse 4, we see that he does the most outrageous power play. He basically plunders the royal treasury and says, look, it's all mine. And by this stage, he's already so powerful because he's got the army on his side that nobody dares argue with him. So he shows off the wealth of the glory of his kingdom and the honor of the splendor of his greatness for 180 days. This wasn't his own money. He was just Ahasuerus. He was just a regular guy. But he presents the welfare of the kingdom as a status symbol, and nobody dares argue. Verse 5, his propaganda campaign continues, where he throws a party for all the people of Shushan, and he invites everybody. And this is an incredible thing. Nobody's ever seen such a thing before. And he's saying, look, this is a new era, he says to the common people. I will speak to you all. You're all important in my eyes, which is great for the common people. They would have hoisted him shoulder high as this new egalitarian monarch who sees them all as the same. And also it is another one in the eye for the nobles, because he's saying, I'll invite everybody to my parties. The nobles no longer count. So it was another two-edged power play that he was exerting on his kingdom to make sure that he would be in charge and that he would stay in charge. Let's now have a look at Vashti's party. Now, you'll recall that back in the day, he's called, in verse 2 there, he's called Hamelech Achashverosh. His title comes before him. That's what he wanted to achieve. Initially, he was Achashverosh HaMelech, but then he becomes Hamelech Achashverosh. When it comes to Vashti's party, he wants to make sure that she is known not as Hamalka Vashti. Her title is not the main thing about her. Even though she was born as royalty and he was just a parvenu, he presents himself as being Hamelech Achashverosh, and she does Vashti Hamalka. She's Vashti, and he presents her title, her royal blood, as an afterthought. Where is her party? Where is her feast? Well, it's not really with him, because he wants to make it clear that she's not on a par with him. He wants himself to be in charge. And he knows that Vashti, being of royal blood, is naturally the one who's going to be more regarded than him. So he demotes her in his eyes as having the woman's party. But he doesn't give her her own palace. It's Beis HaMalchus Asher Melech Achashverosh. It's in the king Achashverosh's palace. He's saying, I'm in charge. She is just a woman. And he wants to assert himself over the remnants of Babylonian greatness that she represents. And he does this in his own disgusting way, where he says, again in verse 11 here, he commands his servants to bring, so this wasn't him inviting her, it was an order that she should be brought, whether she liked it or not. Whom was he inviting to bring? Not Hamalka Vashti, but Vashti Hamalka. Again, he's demeaning her by saying that her title is not important, to bring her before him, and then she will receive Keser Malchus, the crown of the kingdom. So he wants to make it clear that she only gets to be queen now by virtue of his assumed royalty. Thus far, he has asserted himself in his position of power, and also at the same time, he will demean her further by objectifying her and saying, look, she's not a bad looker either. So he's saying she's only a queen because she's married to me. And in fact, it was the other way around. And he's saying she's a good looker. Everybody have a look at her, ogre her and see what you think. Vashti, of course, is outraged at this. She knows that this man is just he was a stable boy in her father Nebuchadnezzar's stables. And she's not having this at all. And she refuses it as Hamalka Vashti. She says, I'm a queen. I'm more royal than you are. No way am I going to come when your servants try to drag me in. I'm not having it. And in a moment, King Ahasuerus' power play is teetering on the brink of collapse. All of a sudden, the king is being insulted by his own wife, this woman whom he sought to demean, in front of everybody. and he's absolutely furious. That's verse 12. What's going to happen next? Now, Ahasuerus, one of his charms is that he was somewhat volatile, as well as being extreme. I mean, he's drinking almost the entire time, so it's hardly surprising. But he's volatile as well, and he decides that he's going to try and calm down a bit and rescue this situation and rehabilitate Vashti as best he can. So he calls people together and he says, I want the people who know custom and law. And he puts custom before law, dos before din, because he wants to make it clear that this is not going to be about what the law says. This is going to be about practice. And he gets Ro'ei Pnei HaMelech, people who know him well, because he wants to do this with a nod and a wink. He wants to bring Vashti back as his queen. After all, she is a good centerpiece for his table seat. She is of royal descent, so it's a prestigious match for him. And he thinks, you know what, maybe I can turn this around in the end. And he says, never mind the law, Kados Ma'alasais. What is the practice about the queen Vashti? And he said to them, you know, after all, she's a queen. That's important for me at the end of the day. I know I said it wasn't, but hey, I'm changing my mind a bit now. He's vacillated. Mumuchon, they say, is Haman. And Haman is the one person in the story who is a better political player than Ahasuerus himself. Haman wants Vashti dead because he has a daughter and he wants his daughter to become queen. And he thinks, if I can just get rid of Vashti, I'm halfway there. I'm a trusted advisor. And then I can be the power behind the throne. And who knows, once I'm in the palace as the father-in-law of the king, maybe I can bump him off and I'll become king. That was Haman's game plan. And Haman says, I'm not having any of this. This is not a personal matter. This is not about your marriage. This is a constitutional matter. And it affects the entire kingdom. And he says, you know, if you allow this to go unchecked, there'll be problems all the way. And he says, what I want you to do, Ahasuerus, disregard your nobles. I know that they see where you're going. I know they are Ro'ei Pnei HaMelech. They can read your mood. Forget that. What I'm saying is, you be in charge by yourself, because he knows that the volatile king will be swayed by him in a moment. Let the word go out from before his majesty. Just you. And he's suggesting a constitutional shift here where King Ahasuerus will concentrate all power in his own hands. He said, disregard all these nobles, never mind them, do as I say and all will be well. You issue the edict, let Vashti indeed be demoted and we'll give it to somebody else. We'll give her crown to somebody else and all will be well. Notice that Haman refers to her not even as Vashti Hamarka, but just as Vashti. He's demeaning her further in the king's eyes, saying she doesn't deserve to be your queen. Get rid of her, and it is your decision. Only you're in charge. You're on the show. That is that. He knows also that Ahasuerus is more vulnerable to his machinations if he's making decisions by himself. And wouldn't you know it, Ahasuerus buys it. Here we see that Haman has the edge over Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus decides to get rid of her, to say that everybody has to be in charge and speak their own language. And that meant that Babylonian as a language was no longer the official language of state. He made it very much a pluralist, multicultural society, where everybody spoke their own language. Babylonian roots were forgotten, and that meant that King Ahasuerus no longer felt like an outsider speaking a language that was not the one that was associated with royalty. So in chapter 1, we see King Ahasuerus almost getting there with the politics, but at the last minute, everything falls flat on its face, and he is outmaneuvered, first of all by his wife, and then by Haman himself. We see that the politics in Megillas Esther does not end well. This is the opening theme of the first story, Ahasuerus and Vashti. Politics does not work. You'll be outmaneuvered by somebody or something else. And Haman has the edge over Ahasuerus, and he takes the lead as the main political man. Let's have a look now at chapter 2. I'm going to skip ahead through much of chapter 2, where we see Esther. She's been taken to the royal palace as one of these many tryouts for the role of queen instead of Vashti. And straight away, she sets about rubbing the palace officials up the wrong way. where they say to her, presumably as a matter of course, where you're from. And she says, I'm not telling. And that's a scandalous thing to do. It's discourteous, it's rebellious, it's truculent. It's the worst thing to do to get into the good books of King Ahasuerus, to defy his officials and presumably the king himself. Why does she do this? Because Mordechai said to her, you mustn't tell. Mordechai knew that Ahasuerus would do anything to break her spirit if he knew she was Jewish. And he knew that he would cause her to violate halacha. So Mordechai said to her, do not reveal that you are Jewish. And that way, your shmiras hamitzvos, your halachic observance, will remain safe. Thus it was that Queen Esther is mute, defiant in the palace. Nonetheless, because she was such a kindly and good person, King Ahasuerus chooses to marry her, and he makes a big party known as the Party of Esther. And he hopes, says the Malbim, that by lavishing attention on her, it will put her even more in the spotlight and make it harder for her to conceal her ethnicity. But she manages to do it anyway. He goes further still, and he gives tax relief to different provinces, and he gives out presents in the hope that she will have him prefer her own people and inadvertently give away where she's from. But Esther stands firm and will not play his game. Then Ahasuerus goes further still in his political machinations, and he assembles more women, hoping that Esther will fear for her position, that she's up against more competition, and that she might try to ingratiate herself with the king by revealing now who she is. But even at this point, she will not tell who she is, and you see that King Ahasuerus' politics is being brought up sharp by Esther's dogged loyalty to Mordechai, her husband, and her people. It's about this time that Mordechai hears about the plot against King Ahasuerus from the sentries on the gate. And Mordechai, as we know, reveals the plot to the king. And what is his amazing reward? Well, you know what? His reward is pretty paltry. And they're hanged on, the malefactors are hanged on a tree. And Mordechai finds that his book is written in the king's private diary. That's it. It's not made a matter of public record. It's just in the king's private diary, which nobody ever reads except the king. And the king can't be bothered reading because he's too befuddled with the drinking. So it's like you mark it down in some private journal on a bit of paper, and it's just filed away. And that's it. Mordechai, of course, is not in the slightest bit fussed, because as you can imagine from the opening power play in this book, Mordechai and Esther are ranged against Haman and Ahasuerus, not only in who they are, but how they play things. Mordechai and Esther only care about doing that which is good. And the politics of this whole situation means nothing to them. And just as you see from the start, King Ahasuerus' politics were set at naught by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a secret way. So too, Esther and Mordechai's loyalty to Torah and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu will see them helped out every step of the way. At the moment, it looks really bad, and it's going to get much worse, but don't worry, it's going to be fine. So, Chapter 3, immediately after this, Ahasuerus promotes Haman. And the rabbis say that what Haman did was he seized on Ahasuerus' loose grip on reality, and he insinuates himself into Ahasuerus' good books and manages to persuade Ahasuerus that it was he, Haman, who revealed the plot against his life from Bigthan and Teresh, the two guards at the gate. And that's why Ahasuerus promotes Haman. Meanwhile, Mordechai is just, and also running all this, and he's had no reward at all for this. So Haman is the new man of the moment. He struts about the court, expecting everybody to bow to him. He's now an important man. He's second in command to the king himself. Yet Mordechai will not bow down to him. Why not? Malbim says Mordechai wanted to be machmir. He wanted to take a strict line and not even appear in the slightest to do anything akin to something connected with Avodah Zarah, with idol worship. So Mordechai wouldn't bow, which on the face of it is an outrageous thing to do. He will get his entire people into trouble for some ridiculous stricture that isn't even really necessary. And yet Mordechai stood firm, and the politics meant nothing to him. All he cared about was Avodas Hashem. And he would not bow and would not kneel. He wouldn't do anything at all. And you can imagine that people, not only Haman, but you can imagine that Mordechai's fellow Jews would have taken a dim view of this, especially when Haman decides to come down hard on his entire nation, the Jewish people, and kill them all because of Mordechai's religious extremism and intransigence and his unwillingness to get with the times. Now, Haman has to play Ahasuerus again, and believe me, he does it beautifully. And he puts it to the king that you got these Jews here who are backward. They're not up to date. They're not in the trend. They're not proper. They're not showing proper citizenship. Let's see what we can do to educate them and bring them into the modern world. So he says, there's these people, the Jews. He doesn't actually mention them by name because he knows the Jews are famous and they're important. And he says, Yikosev la'abdom. Now the translation here says for their destruction, but Malbim says it doesn't mean that. It means let them be assimilated out of their Judaism into being regular citizens. And the people who do this work, who re-educate the Jews, will be so grateful that they will pay for the privilege of re-educating the Jews. The king, of course, agrees with this. He's not fussed. Then what does Haman actually do? He sends out an edict to destroy, kill, and rub out all the Jews. He actually talking genocide, but he conceals that from Ahasuerus. And once again, Ahasuerus is plagued by this. He has no idea what's going on. Haman has won the day. Mordechai knows what has happened, and he makes us, what you might have thought from a cultured Shushan person's point of view, he makes a spectacle of himself. He wanders into the streets looking in absolute fright. He tears his garments, he wears sackcloth and ashes, he shouts and yells, and he goes right in front of the palace looking like this. And this is absolutely not decorous. And Esther says to him, you can't do this. At least, change your clothes and come into me and remove your sackcloth from upon yourself and at least wear it underneath your clothes and come and see me. Talk to me. And he says, no, he did not accept it for a moment. He wouldn't even wear his sackcloth underneath his clothes because that would have meant desisting from his prayers and repentance and mourning for a moment. And he wouldn't stop for one moment, even though it's politically expedient to do so, because again, Mordechai did not care about the politics of this. He only cared about serving Hashem. And he tells Esther, you need to go to the king and do something. And Esther wavers at this point, and she says, if I do that, it's not going to work politically. If I go there, I might get killed. He's not asked me to come for a long time. I can't do that. And she's trying to play this Haman and Ahasuerus' way, but going with the politics rather than with the Emunah. And Mordechai says, do not think that the politics will save you. If you play politics, you will die. It's not a time for politics. Go there, forget planning, go there, intercede, do whatever you got to do. I can't advise you what to do because I have no idea and it doesn't really matter. Just go to the king and sort this out. So, Esther has to go to the king, fully expecting to die in the process. And she basically gives away everything. She throws away all of her rank, all of her marriage, all of her life to do this. The rabbis say that in going to Ahasuerus voluntarily, this meant that her last hope of reuniting with Mordechai was to be lost. Because the rabbis say she was married to Mordechai. She wasn't just his cousin, she was married to him. And by going voluntarily to Ahasuerus, that meant that she had submitted to his attentions, and therefore she had to become divorced from Mordechai and could never remarry him. So she was giving up her marriage. She also thought she would die. She was giving up her life. What happened in that glorious moment when she's prepared to sacrifice everything? He says, Vatubash Esther Malchus. Esther wore royalty. The Rabbi said this is Ruach HaKodesh. God himself robed her with prophecy. And the king was there. And she says to the king, come to my party. And she doesn't know what to do. She says, come to a party of mine. At that party, she doesn't really have much to say. And you might have thought it had been embarrassing, but at the second party, the first party, she says, come to my next party. Now, what was the plan here? Why not just get on with it at the first party? Say, look, Haman is trying to party. And the answer is that Esther was waiting for a sign. And at the first party, nothing happened. So all she could do was hope for something to come apparent that would make things okay. And she said, I'm going to have another party tomorrow, and then tomorrow I'll do it. That's one explanation. Another explanation is that she needed the Jews to daven. And she thought that if I come to a party with Haman, and Haman comes away strutting and grinning, they'll think that the Jews will think I have sold out to Haman, and then they'll daven. And she was right. Because it says, when the end of that first party, he was absolutely thrilled with the way it had gone. He was happy, he was goodly of heart, he thought all was well. And here we see the first crack in Haman's facade. He wanted to have everything. And when he saw one Jew, not even in the palace, but in the palace, at the palace gate, who wouldn't bow to him, he was more furious than ever. That was the beginning of the end for Haman. And it goes on. That night, the king couldn't sleep. So what happened? He told them to bring the Sefer HaZichronos Divrei Hayamim. These were the things that were to be read before the king. Do you remember back in chapter 2, Mordechai's deeds about rescuing the king from Bigthan and Teresh weren't written in the official court annals. They were written in the king's private diary that he never bothered to read. And the rabbis say, if Mordechai's rescue of the king had been written in the official court record, Haman would have erased it because he wanted to use that story to advance himself in power. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned it and made sure that Mordechai's rescue of the king would be written in a place that could not be assailed by Haman. It was in the king's private diary. And now, chapter 6, the king decides out of the blue to read his diary. And he says, now what good did we ever do to Mordechai? And the reason why the king says this is that he's looking for people to be nice to because he's worried. Why couldn't he sleep? Because he's worried about why Esther is inviting him to a party with Haman. What's Haman about? Him and the queen, I understand, but Haman? What's Haman doing in this little intimate circle? Maybe he's out to get me. So Haman thought, so the king thought, I need to find a way around this. And maybe if I do Mordechai a favor, he'll tell me what's going on. And he sees an opportunity here to be nice to Mordechai. And maybe Mordechai's tongue will loosen because that's how Ahasuerus is. He's a political player. And at that very moment, Haman is coming. And here we see further cracks in Haman's politicking. And the king says to Haman, what shall we do for somebody whom we want to honor? And Haman, of course, thought it was talking about himself, and he lets himself loose. He says, well, they should have the king's garments, because the Persian law was, says the Malbim, that if you wore the king's garments, anything that you said had to be done, and the king's horse and the king's crown, and somebody should bring that honored person and parade them around in the town in the king's clothes and on the king's horse and say, thus will be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor. So the rabbi said, the Gemara says that when the king said to Haman, do that to Mordechai, Haman tried to stall. He said, well, who's Mordechai? So King Ahasuerus said, well, Mordechai the Jew. So Haman said, I don't know, there could be lots of Mordechai the Jews. Which one do you mean? So the king said, Mordechai the Jew who's sitting in the gates of the king. He's always there. That crazy one with the torn garments who shouts and yells all the time. Yeah, him. And Haman is aghast when he realizes he can't get out of this. And the Gemara says he suggests other things. He says, well, why not give Mordechai some tax roll where he can tax the people and have the profits of a toll road or duties from people passing by in a river. And he comes up with lots of other things for the king to do to Mordechai, anything but have him parade Mordechai through the streets. And the king says, you know what? Do all that as well. Do not drop anything that you said. And Haman suddenly realizes that all the honor he sought for himself is working against him in favor of his arch enemy Mordechai. And he realizes now that all his politics is being undone because the Kadosh Baruch Hu will not let your politics work against the divine plan. So Haman has to do it, and he's not best pleased. And he returns home, and this is a famous midrash that you probably know. He's pushed back to his home. Ovel v'chafurosh, he's mourning. Why is he mourning? What was the bereavement? And he's also chafurosh, his head is covered. And the rabbis say that his daughter saw this person being led around in the royal garments and assumed that it was Mordechai leading her father on the horse. So she emptied her household detritus over the head of the person leading the horse. And when this person shouted and yelled, she recognized her father's voice, realized that she'd emptied her pot over her own father's head and threw herself off the roof to her death. So Haman, as well as having endured this terrible disgrace of leading his arch enemy Mordechai through the streets, Mordechai the crazy, who goes around in torn clothes, he had to lead him through the streets of all people. Not only that, he was bereaved of his only daughter, and he looked an absolute fright. Haman storms off home, and he says, what's going on? I was doing so well, and now look what's happening. And his friends say to him, well, you know, Mordechai is a Jew, and the Jews are either like the stars of the sky or the sand of the sea. And you had Mordechai before, you had him when he was like the dust of the ground underfoot. Now he's like the stars. You're going to fall before him, and there is nothing you can do. Mordechai suddenly realizes he's committed another terrible gaffe because he was invited to the queen's second party and he forgot, which is a tremendously horrendous gaffe to do. How can you stand up the king and queen who invited you to a private party? And he forgot. So, and all of a sudden the guards come along saying, you're invited to the party, you're late, where are you? And they hurry Haman along to this party. Remember that he was stinking and disgusting and disheveled from this incident, and presumably he took all his stink and filth along to this party and presumably tried to smarten himself up along the way, but he would not have been looking at his best as he comes into this party on the second occasion. And now Esther's had her sign. She's seen Haman being forced to parade Mordechai through the streets. She knows it's going to be okay. And she says, it's a very odd thing in chapter 7, when she says to the king, you know, somebody's trying to destroy my people. And she says two phrases, Ish Tzav Oyev, a belligerent and hostile man, Hazeh, this evil Haman. And why did she say two phrases? And the Gemara says that she pointed to Achashverosh. Why did she point to King Achashverosh at this crucial moment? And the answer is that Esther wasn't actually talking to the king at all. She was talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. She was davening. She didn't care what Achashverosh thought, because it's all about HaKadosh Baruch Hu saving her and her people. And what King Achashverosh thought and what Haman thought mattered not one jot. So she didn't try to sort out the politics and diplomacy and the etiquette. She davened to Hashem at that crucial moment. And when Hashem says to her, who is it who's destroying your people? Esther pointed to Achashverosh and said, he's the king. It's on his watch. He's in charge. It's his fault. And the Malach had to come along and move her finger across to point it to Haman and say, Haman hara hazeh. She remembered herself and looking at Haman found what the Malach said Haman. And Haman, of course, was gobsmacked at this. And we know that he tried to beg for his life. And that bit of politics went wrong as well, because an angel kept pushing him down on Esther's couch, and King Ahasuerus had gone out to try and calm down, and he comes back and finds Haman being repeatedly pushed up and down onto Esther's couch, and he's even more furious when he sees his prime minister apparently trying to assault his queen repeatedly in this obscene way, and Haman loses his life. Now, I'm just going to zip through the rest of certain key points in the book, and you see how this theme continues. Chapter 8, verses 11 to 12. The number of people who were killed in the battle between the Jews and their enemies comes before the king. And the rabbis say that this was Amalek. It was Haman's family and his friends, the Amalekites in the kingdom, who brought this number to Ahasuerus to make him stop the slaughter. And the king is initially swayed by this. And he says, in Shushan, the capital, the Jews had killed 500 people and the 10 sons of Haman. What else had they done? And you can imagine when he says this, he's not best pleased. He's not happy at all this bloodshed, because the more people dead, the less taxes. And unrest in the kingdom doesn't look good for him. He wants to have a peaceful, tranquil rule, which brings lots of money into the royal coffers. Not all is fighting. And then all of a sudden, his tone changes. What is your request, and it will be given to you? What else do you want, and it will be done? And the rabbi said that a malach came and hit Ahasuerus on the mouth when he started complaining about the divine plan to rid the world of the enemies of the Jews. And he had to climb down and say that which was right. Over here we see that the Jewish people in Shushan had to fight for an extra day. That's why in walled cities, the Purim is celebrated on the 15th. And the rabbis say that the Jews in Shushan relied on the enemy, relied on the army rather. They thought, we live in the capital, there won't be any unrest here, we don't need to fight our enemies, Ahasuerus' soldiers will do it for us. And they didn't. So they had to do the mitzvah of fighting, as Mordechai had said, of Megillas Amalek, wiping out Amalek. They had to do it for an extra day. And this remembrance of the extra fighting in Shushan is not a happy thing. It's a bit of a rebuke to the people living at the Jews living at the top of the social tree around the capital, those who'd been to that party probably, that in fact there's a bit of a critique of them here, that they had to fight for an extra day because they didn't do the mitzvah of fighting when they should have done. A second. Now, here also we see a spiritual mending of the Jewish people, something that is beyond politics that the Jewish people do. What happened? The Jewish people had to do Mishlach Manos Matanos Avyanim. Remember, Haman had said, Yeshna Amechad Mufuzah Mufara Ben Ha'amim. There's a people who is scattered and divided, and they are between the nations. They assimilate. They argue with one another. They're scattered. They don't make proper communities. And now the Jewish people had to mend that initial accusation and make sure that in future they would be knit properly together. So all the Jewish people had to have days of celebration and feasting and sending portions to one another to build bridges of friendship between one another. And there could also be no class divide. Those who were poor had to be given presents. So everybody will feel united as a nation and all will be well. One is the ultimate salvation of the Jewish people, when it says, the Jewish people, they fulfilled and accepted upon themselves to do these mitzvahs. Now, that's a bit odd. It should say kiblu v'kimu. First they accepted it and then they fulfilled it. Why does it say they fulfilled it and then they accepted it? How can you fulfill something you've not yet accepted as a rule? So the rabbis say the most beautiful thing, they fulfilled that which they had received a long time ago. Back in the day when the Jewish people were at Har Sinai, they received the Torah out of fear because Kof Aleim Har Kagigis, the mountain was suspended above the Jewish people. Now the Jewish people properly saw the Yad Hashem cared for them, and you don't need politics when Hashem is on your side, and you have nothing at all to fear from the likes of Ahasuerus and the likes of Haman with all their fancy politics and their manipulating of the state machinery. It is irrelevant, because if you've got a Kadosh Baruch Hu on your side, you are strong, you are free, you are safe, you are loved. So now the Jewish people receive the Torah in love. They fulfilled the thing that they had already received a long time ago. Kimu Masha Kiblu Kavar. The Jewish people had all got the message that it's not about politics, it's about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's move to the very end of the chapter. We see that Ahasuerus was able to put a tax not only on the land, but even on the islands, in the far-flung places that were a long way away. How come he could do this tax and get even more revenue for his kingdom? because he'd helped the Jews unwillingly, but he'd helped them. So Emmanuel of Rome, one of the commentaries on one medieval commentaries on the Megillas says that Ahasuerus was rewarded by Kadosh Baruch Hu for helping the Jews. And wouldn't you know it, Mordechai's greatness was actually recorded in the official books of the kings, even though he wasn't a king, because he was such a great person and so well respected. This was the Mordechai who wasn't afraid to make a spectacle of himself for the sake of Avodas Hashem. He didn't care what they thought about him when he paraded himself around the town square with torn clothes, sackcloth and ashes, shouting and yelling. He didn't care because he was talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Mishnah in Tanis says that when in a time of crisis, you gather in a town square. And that's what Mordechai did. And look at the honor that Mordechai got at the end, because he prepared to discharge and reject his honor for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Look at the honor he got, being paraded around that same town square by Haman, the prime minister. And now at the end of the story, he's written in the chronicles of the kings. He's like royalty, even though all he cared about was the King of Kings, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And finally, Ahasuerus here is taken to be a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who is Acharis Vereshis. He's the end and he's the beginning. He's the king in charge of everything. And he makes sure that Modai and Poros, that Modai Daim is enough. He makes sure that everything has a sufficiency and no more. And Poros means reward. He makes sure that everybody gets the proper reward. And thus it was that the king who was in charge of everything instituted taxes that needed to be done. And Mordechai got his full reward from the king who says, die, enough to our troubles, and Poros, reward for our goodness. And thus it was that Mordechai was Mishneh Melech Ahasuerus. He was a helper for not just King Ahasuerus, but the real king, Acharis Vereshis Tzilai. He was a help to the king himself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was great for the Jews. He was beloved by the multitude of his brothers. He brought good for his kingdom, and he brought peace for all his descendants. This was the man who rejected politics, who rejected keeping up with the times for pure Emunah and pure B'tachon, and he encouraged Esther to do the same, and she did the same thing, and they rescued our kingdom. And those who tried to use politics against us ended up with their politics failing. Ahasuerus let it go halfway through and ended up with a modicum of fame. Haman, who kept with the politics to the bitter end, ended up hanged on a tree in disgrace. The message for us is so crystal clear. It's all about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's our focus, that's our beginning, that's our end. Nothing else matters. When we remember that Hashem Echad Shmo Echad, He's the only thing that matters, we are invincible, and our service to the world as Mamlechas Kohanim V'Ger Kodesh will be unstoppable, will be crowned with the triumph of our own faith. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Either unmute or put on the chat.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
So I'll take this opportunity to thank you so much, Rabbi Lister. Really fascinating and insightful analysis of the interplay between politics and Megillah, and bringing Megillah to life for us and putting us in the right frame of mind for Purim. So thank you. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the committee. We're a committee who organized these shiurim, from Riley Close, Robertson Ginsbury, Naomi Landy, and Sandy Lippman, and from Israel, Robertson Zobin, Michelle Seat, Debbie Meyer, Julie Korn, and Daniela Reich. I'd like to thank you all for joining. We are already planning our summer series, which will start and it will obviously, it's going to start on Zoom on Sunday nights. We miss being in shul as we have in past years, but we'll take it as it comes. So thank you very much once again, Rabbi Lister. And
I should say that I've got the notes. Lena, I'll email them to you. So if anybody wants to have the notes, I've got all the notes in my computer. I'll email them to you. And if you'd like to pass them through, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. And you can see the thanks coming through on the chat.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Lister. Lovely. A different way of looking at things.
I'm glad thank you very much. It's
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.